The postcard arrived on a Tuesday, 32 years too late. 4 smiling faces under a Florida sun with "having the best time" scrawled in Jessica's handwriting on the back. But Jessica Hamilton had been dead for 3 decades, and her brother. Alan's hands shook as he read the postmark, Panama City, March 15th, 2021. Someone was playing games with a grieving family's pain. Or maybe, after all these years of searching, someone finally wanted to tell the truth. Alan had spent half his life hunting for answers about what happened during that spring break in 1989, when 4 college girls checked into the Coral Reef Hotel and simply vanished. The police called it a probable runaway case. The families called it a nightmare, but Alan called it what it was: murder. And now, as demolition crews prepared to tear down the pink and white hotel that had haunted his dreams, that postcard felt like a message from the grave. His sister's grave, the one he'd never been able to find. Some secrets stay buried in sun-soaked sand and tourist smiles. Others claw their way to the surface, demanding justice. This is the story of 4 girls who went to paradise and found hell, and the brother who refused to let their memory die with them. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The silver Volkswagen van pulled into the Coral Reef Hotel parking lot as the Florida sun blazed overhead. 4 college girls tumbled out, their laughter mixing with crashing waves and distant beach music. Jessica Hamilton stepped out first, blonde hair catching sunlight as she stretched. At 20, she was their unofficial leader, always carrying her Polaroid camera and making the plans. "I can't believe we're finally here," Jessica exclaimed, pulling her camera from her beach bag. She'd been documenting their friendship since freshman year at Florida State University. Maria Thompson emerged next, dark curls bouncing as she grabbed her duffel bag, the practical one who managed their budget and remembered sunscreen. The drive felt endless, but look at this place, she said, gesturing toward the pink and white hotel stretching along pristine coastline. Leanne Parker climbed out slowly, unusually subdued. The recent breakup with her boyfriend of 2 years had hit, harder than she'd admitted, but she was determined not to ruin their spring break. Her red hair was pulled back messily, oversized sunglasses hiding the circles under her green eyes. Tasha Williams stepped out last, smoothing her sundress and looking around nervously. The familiar knot formed in her stomach whenever reminded of the financial gap between herself and her roommates. Her partial scholarship covered tuition, but not spring break luxuries. "This place is incredible," Tasha said, forcing enthusiasm. The hotel was more upscale than expected, with grand entrance and manicured grounds. Expensive cars filled the valet area. Jessica raised her camera, snapping a photo of them by the van, the Polaroid whirred, producing its familiar white square. "This is going to be the best week ever," she declared, waving the developing photo. They grabbed luggage and headed inside, where glass doors revealed a lobby decorated in tropical pastels. Behind the reception desk, a silver-haired woman in her 50s smiled warmly. "Welcome to the Coral Reef Hotel," she said. "I'm Mrs. Durling, the concierge. You must be the Florida State girls." "That's us," Jessica replied cheerfully, approaching. "With confirmation papers." Mrs. Durling's smile faltered as she looked them over. "Such lovely young ladies. I hope you'll be careful during your stay. Spring break can be unpredictable. I always tell guests not to stay out too late, especially young women traveling together." Maria laughed, nudging Jessica. "We can take care of ourselves." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Durling replied, but her expression remained serious. "Just remember, the hotel is your safe haven. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Their 4th floor room overlooked the beach and pool. 2 double beds filled most of the space, with a small balcony offering stunning Gulf views. Jessica claimed the window bed, while others sorted belongings. "First shower," Leanne announced, disappearing into the bathroom. Tasha sat on the bed edge, watching friends unpack designer clothes and expensive cosmetics. She'd brought thrift store finds and drugstore makeup, but told herself it didn't matter. "What's the plan?" Maria asked, consulting the hotel brochure. "Pool party this afternoon, tiki bar until 2 a.m. Jessica was changing into her bright yellow bikini. "Pool party first, dinner, then nightlife. I heard about this club called Waves." The afternoon flew by in sunshine, chlorine, and tropical drinks. They played pool volleyball, lounged on chairs, and took dozens of photos. The area buzzed with college students creating youthful energy. At the tiki bar, they met Rick Morrison, the bartender who'd become central to their story. Late 20s, sun-bleached brown hair, easy charm from years in hospitality, his practiced smile seemed genuine as he mixed drinks. "First time at the Coral Reef?" he asked, sliding a pina colada to Leanne. "Spring break virgins," Jessica laughed. Raising her drink, Rick's eyes lingered on Leanne's red hair and freckled shoulders. "You've come to the right place. This hotel knows how to show people a good time." Leanne blushed under his attention. After months of feeling rejected post-breakup, the bartender's interest boosted her confidence. "Maybe you could recommend good places tonight?" "Waves is definitely the spot," Rick said, leaning closer. "I get off at midnight. Maybe I'll see you there." The flirtation was obvious. Her friends exchanged knowing glances, glad to see Leanne emerging from her shell. As sunset painted the sky orange and pink, they returned to prepare for dinner and nightlife. Over an hour getting dressed, doing hair, taking mirror photos. Tasha got caught up in the excitement. Dinner was beachside seafood, sharing shrimp and crab platters while watching waves crash. Conversation flowed easily about classes and summer plans, feeling like old times before complications entered their friendship. "I'm so glad we did this," Maria said, raising her wine glass. "Senior year will be crazy, and who knows where we'll end up after graduation." "Don't get sentimental," Jessica teased warmly. "We're going to be friends forever." They clinked glasses as daylight faded. The beach transformed with tiki torches casting dancing shadows and music drifting from various venues. Waves exceeded expectations, packed with college students from across the southeast, creating a sea of young faces flushed with alcohol and excitement. Music loud enough to feel in their chests, dance floor writhing with bodies. They found a table near the bar, ordering their first round. Jessica chose beer, Maria a cosmopolitan, Leanne rum and coke, Tasha reluctantly the cheapest option. House, vodka with cranberry. The night unfolded in typical college party rhythm, dancing, laughing, flirting with boys from other schools. Jessica documented everything with her camera, capturing pure joy and abandon. Leanne seemed to be having the time of her life, earlier sadness forgotten. Around 11, Rick appeared as promised. He changed into jeans and white button-down, carrying himself with confident ease. He spotted Leanne immediately, making his way through the crowd. "Ladies," he said, sliding next to Leanne. "How's your night?" "Better now," Leanne replied, words slightly slurred. Rick signaled the waitress, ordering a round and insisting on paying. As the night progressed, group dynamics shifted. Rick's attention focused entirely on Leanne, and she clearly enjoyed it. They moved to the dance floor together, leaving the others at the table. Jessica and Maria seemed happy for their friend, but Tasha grew uncomfortable. "I feel like such a third wheel," she shouted over music. "Don't be silly," Maria replied. "We're all having fun." But Tasha wasn't. She'd nursed the same drink for over an hour, watching friends order round after round without thinking about cost. The gap between their worlds felt wider than ever. Resentment building, the situation exploded when Jessica suggested bottle service. "More fun than waiting at the bar," she said, signaling the waitress. "How much does that cost?" Tasha asked, dreading the answer. "Don't worry about it," Jessica replied dismissively. "We'll split it 4 ways." "I can't afford that," Tasha said, voice tight with embarrassment and anger. Then don't pay, Jessica shot back, annoyed. It's not a big deal. But it was to Tasha, tired of being the charity case, constantly worrying about money while friends spent freely. I'm going back to the hotel. Come on, Tasha, Maria tried intervening. We're having such a good time. No, we're not, Tasha replied, standing. You're having a good time. I'm just the poor girl who can't keep up. The argument attracted nearby attention, Jessica's face flushing with embarrassment. You're being ridiculous. We invited you because we wanted you here. Right, like some charity project, Tasha shot back. I'm going back, don't wait up. She pushed through the crowd toward the exit, ignoring friends' calls. Night air was cooler than expected. She regretted not bringing a jacket. The walk back gave time to cool down, but also feel ashamed of her outburst. Back at the club, Tasha's departure dampened the mood. Leanne was too caught up with Rick to notice, but Jessica and Maria exchanged worried glances. Should we go after her? Maria asked. She'll be fine, Jessica replied unconvincingly. She just needs to cool off. They stayed until closing, Leanne and Rick becoming increasingly intimate. At some point, someone bought Leanne a drink while she was in the bathroom, but she was too intoxicated to notice it tasted different. The added substance was tasteless and odorless, designed to make her compliant and less likely to remember. Details. Preparing to leave, Maria noticed someone watching from across the street. A man in a dark jacket stood in shadows, between buildings, face obscured by a baseball cap. When she nudged Jessica and pointed, he melted back into darkness. Probably just some creep, Jessica said, but felt a chill despite the warm night. Rick offered to walk them back, an offer they gratefully accepted. Streets were busy with other spring breakers, but something was unsettling about the watching man. Rick chatted easily as they walked, arm around Leanne's waist to steady her increasingly. Unsteady steps. You okay? He asked as they reached the hotel lobby. Just tired, Leanne mumbled, leaning heavily against him. The drug made her drowsy and disoriented, though she attributed it to alcohol. I'll make sure they get to their room safely, Ricky told Jessica and Maria, guiding Leanne toward the elevator. We can take care of her, Jessica said, but Rick was already pressing the button. Don't worry, I've got this, he replied firmly. You girls get some sleep. Elevator doors closed before Jessica could protest, leaving her and Maria alone in the lobby. They looked at each other uncertainly, feeling something wasn't right, but unable to articulate what. Maybe we should have insisted, Maria said, waiting for the next elevator. Rick seems nice enough, Jessica replied, already second-guessing. They rode up in silence, both lost in thought. The hallway was empty and quiet, only their footsteps on carpet. Jessica fumbled with the keycard, hands shaking from alcohol and unease. The room was dark and quiet. Tasha was apparently asleep, clothes scattered on the floor. Jessica called out softly, but no response. They got ready for bed quietly, whispering about the night's events. Where's Leanne? Maria asked suddenly, realizing their friend hadn't returned. Probably still talking to Rick, Jessica replied, though worry was building. You know how she gets when she likes someone. They decided to wait up, but exhaustion eventually won. Maria fell asleep first, curled facing the door. Jessica tried staying awake, but alcohol and fatigue took over. Around 3 a.m., Jessica was awakened by the door opening. She sat up groggily, expecting Leanne, but the room remained dark and quiet. She called out softly. No response. Assuming her friend had come in and gone straight to bed, Jessica rolled over and slept. She didn't know someone had indeed entered, moving with practiced silence, observing the sleeping girls for several long minutes before leaving as quietly as they'd arrived. As dawn broke over the gulf, painting the sky in soft pastels, the Coral Reef Hotel began stirring. But in room 412, something was terribly wrong. Jessica woke around 8, head pounding from drinking. The room was bright with sunlight streaming through balcony doors, sounds of waves and distant laughter from the beach. She sat up slowly, trying to piece together the previous night. She expected to hear "Good morning, sunshine" from friends, but the room was eerily quiet. Looking around, she realized Leanne's bed was empty and hadn't been slept in. Covers were neatly folded, pillow showing no use. Jessica's heart raced as she shook Maria awake. "Maria, wake up, where's Leanne?" Maria sat up, confused and disoriented. "What time is it? Isn't she in her bed?" "No, and it doesn't look like she came back." They turned to Tasha's bed, expecting to find their friend sleeping off her anger. But that bed was empty too, covers thrown back as if someone had left hurriedly. "Tasha," Jessica called, checking the bathroom. "Empty." Cold dread settled as reality became clear. Both friends were missing, no sign of where they might have gone. "Maybe they went to breakfast," Maria suggested unconvincingly. "Without telling us?" "And look," Jessica said, pointing to belongings scattered around. Leanne's purse was on the dresser, Tasha's wallet on the nightstand. They wouldn't leave without their things. Jessica grabbed her Polaroid camera with shaking hands. She'd taken a photo the night before, but when? Details were fuzzy, blurred by alcohol and sleep. She found undeveloped film, realizing she'd taken a picture on the balcony before bed. The image showed 3 figures against the night sky: herself, and what appeared to be Leanne and Tasha. But something was wrong. In the background, barely visible, was another figure, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. "Maria, look at this," Jessica said, voice trembling as she showed the photograph. The implications began sinking in. Someone had been watching them, close enough to appear in their private balcony moment. "We need to call the police," Maria said, reaching for the phone. As she dialed, both girls couldn't shake the feeling they were already too late. Their friends were gone, vanished into the Florida night without a trace, leaving only questions and the haunting image of a shadowy figure watching from darkness. The call came in at 9:47 a.m., logged as a possible missing persons case. Detective Lou Ramirez was finishing morning coffee when the dispatcher described 2 college students who had apparently vanished overnight. At 42, with 15 years on the Panama City Police Department, Ramirez had seen his share of spring break incidents. Most involved drunk kids who wandered off and turned up hours later, embarrassed and hungover. But something about this case felt different from the moment he walked into room 412. Jessica Hamilton and Maria Thompson sat on one bed, both pale and shaking. The room looked like a crime scene frozen in time, belongings scattered, beds unmade, overwhelming sense that something terrible had happened. "Tell me again what happened last night," Ramirez said, pulling out his notebook and settling into the room's single chair. Jessica took a shuddering breath. "We went to Waves, this club downtown. Tasha got upset and left early around midnight. She was here when we got back, asleep. Leanne was with this bartender named Rick, and he said he'd make sure she got back safely. But she never came back," Maria added. "And when we woke up, both beds were empty." Ramirez examined the scene carefully. Tasha's wallet was on the nightstand, containing her driver's license, student ID, and $30. Leanne's purse sat on the dresser, identification tucked inside with her room key. These weren't actions of girls who decided to take off. "This photograph," Ramirez said, studying the Polaroid Jessica showed him. "You took this last night?" "Right before sleep. I always take pictures of our trips." Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "But I don't remember anyone else being out there." The image was grainy and unclear, but definitely showed a 4th figure in the background. Someone had been watching them on the balcony, close enough to be captured by the flash. Ramirez's first stop was the hotel's front desk, where Mrs. Durling greeted him with concerned expression that seemed genuine. "Such lovely girls," she said, shaking her head sadly. "I warned them to be careful. Spring break brings out dangerous people." "Did you see them come in last night?" I went off duty at 11, but the night clerk told me 2 came back around 2:30. Ramirez made a note to interview the night clerk, though he suspected little useful information. Hotels during spring break were chaos, hundreds of guests coming and going constantly. Next stop was Waves. In harsh daylight, the venue looked tired and seedy, nothing like the glamorous hotspot it pretended to be at night. The manager, heavy-set Phil Kowalski, was setting up for business. "Rick Morrison," Phil said when asked about the bartender. "Good worker, popular with customers, especially college girls." "Is he here today?" "Called in sick. First time in 6 months, actually. Usually very reliable." Ramirez got Rick's address and drove to the small apartment complex where he lived. Typical service worker housing, cheap, functional, showing its age. Rick's second-floor apartment overlooked a parking lot with rusty cars and overgrown weeds. Rick answered after the third knock, looking genuinely surprised to see police. Wearing pajama pants and wrinkled t-shirt, hair messy from sleep. But his eyes were alert, and Ramirez noticed his hands were scratched and dirty. "Officer, what can I do for you?" Rick asked, not inviting him inside. "I'm investigating the disappearance of 2 college students. Witnesses say you left with one of them last night." Rick's expression didn't change, but Ramirez caught a flicker of something, fear maybe, or calculation. "Oh, the redhead. Yeah, I walked them back to their hotel. She was pretty drunk, wanted to make sure she got there safely. What happened after you got to the hotel?" "I left them in the lobby and went home. Had to work this morning." Rick shrugged, but the gesture seemed forced. "Is she okay? Did something happen?" Ramirez studied the man's face, looking for tells. "She and her friend are missing. No one's seen them since last night." "That's terrible," Rick said, but his tone was flat, lacking genuine concern. "I hope they turn up okay." The interview continued for 10 minutes, but Rick's story remained consistent. He'd walked the girls to the hotel, left them in the lobby, gone straight home. He claimed no knowledge of what happened after, providing a neighbor's name who could allegedly confirm his alibi. But when Ramirez spoke to the neighbor, elderly Mrs. Peterson, her story didn't quite match. "I heard Rick come home around 3, she said, peering through thick glasses, which was unusual because he's usually much quieter. There was noise from his apartment, like moving furniture." "Are you sure about the time?" "Oh, yes. I'm a light sleeper. It woke me up and I looked at the clock. 3:15 to be exact." The discrepancy was small but significant. If Rick left the girls in the lobby around 2:30, what had he been doing for the next 45 minutes? And what activity would sound like moving furniture at 3 a.m.? Ramirez returned to interview the night clerk, young Kevin Bradley, who worked graveyard shift to pay for community college. Kevin remembered 2 girls coming in around 2:30, but his recollection was vague. "It was crazy busy," Kevin explained. "Spring break weekend, people coming and going all night. I barely looked up from the desk." "Did you see them go upstairs?" "I think so. 2 girls, 1 blonde, 1 brunette. They were with some guy, but he didn't go up with them." "Can you describe—" "The guy," Kevin concentrated. "Tall, I think, dark hair. Honestly, I was dealing with a drunk guy trying to check in without ID, so I wasn't really paying attention. It was a frustrating pattern that would define the entire investigation. Partial memories, vague recollections, crucial details no one remembered clearly. Spring break chaos provided perfect cover for someone wanting to make people disappear. Hotel management proved even less helpful. General Manager Robert Henley, a slick man in his 50s, seemed more concerned about the hotel's reputation than missing girls. "This is very unfortunate," Henley said, adjusting his tie nervously. "But you have to understand, Detective, we have a business to run. Spring break is our biggest season, and we can't have wild rumors scaring customers." "2 young women are missing," Ramirez said, voice hard. "That's not a rumor. Of course, we want to cooperate fully, but we also need to be discreet." Perhaps we could handle this quietly, without involving media. Ramirez felt his first real surge of anger. Mr. Henley, this is a police investigation, not a public relations problem. If you're more concerned about your bottom line than two missing. Girls, maybe I should look at your involvement. Henley's face went white. Detective, I assure you, the hotel had nothing to do with this. We run a respectable establishment. But Ramirez was noticing things that didn't add up. The hotel's security system was surprisingly sophisticated for a beachfront resort, with cameras covering every entrance and most public areas. Yet when he asked for footage from the previous night, Henley claimed there had been a technical malfunction that corrupted the files. Very convenient, Ramirez muttered, but without video evidence he had little choice but to accept the explanation. As word of the disappearance spread, families began arriving. Jessica's parents drove from Tallahassee. Maria's family flew from Atlanta. But it was Alan Hamilton, Jessica's older brother, who made the biggest impression on Ramirez. At 28, Alan was a successful software engineer who'd always been protective of his younger sister. Tall and lean with Jessica's blonde hair, but none of her easygoing nature. From the moment he arrived, he made clear he wouldn't let this case disappear quietly. I want to know everything, Alan said, sitting across from Ramirez in the station. Every lead, every witness, every piece of evidence. Mr. Hamilton, I understand your concern, but this is an active investigation. We can't share all details with family members. Then what can you tell me? Because right now, it sounds like you have nothing. Ramirez had to admit Alan wasn't wrong. After 3 days of investigation, they had more questions than answers. Rick Morrison had lawyered up and refused another interview. Hotel security footage was mysteriously corrupted. The few witnesses had conflicting stories, and there was no physical evidence suggesting violence or struggle. We're treating this as missing persons, Ramirez explained. But without evidence of foul play, there's a limit to what we can do. Evidence of foul play. Alan's voice rose. 2 women vanish without a trace, leaving behind identification and money, and you don't think that's evidence of foul play? Ramirez sighed. He agreed with Alan, but police work was about more than gut feelings. We're doing everything we can. We've issued bulletins to law enforcement agencies across the state. We're checking hospitals, morgues, homeless shelters. If they're out there, we'll find them. But as days turned to weeks, hope began fading. Initial urgency gave way to other cases, other priorities. Spring break ended. Thousands of college students returned to normal lives. The Coral Reef Hotel returned to normal rhythm. Staff eager to forget anything unusual had happened. Alan refused to give up. He took leave from his job, rented a small Panama City apartment, determined to continue searching. He interviewed every hotel employee he could find, visited every bar and restaurant the girls might have gone to, followed up on every tip from the police hotline. During one informal interview, he discovered something Ramirez had missed. Housekeeping supervisor Carmen Valdez had been working the night shift when the girls disappeared, and she remembered something unusual. There was a service elevator running late that night, she told Alan in heavily accented English. Strange, because we don't usually use it after midnight, but I saw it going to the 4th floor around 3 o'clock. Did you see who was using it? Carmen shook her head. I was on the 2nd floor cleaning rooms, but I heard it because the motor makes a loud noise, very distinctive. Alan brought this information to Ramirez, who added it to the growing file. But without more concrete evidence, it was just another puzzle piece with no solution. The case began attracting media attention, though not the kind families hoped for. A local news station ran a story about the spring break disappearance, but it was sensationalized, focusing more on party atmosphere than human tragedy. National media showed little interest in what appeared to be just another case of college students behaving irresponsibly. As summer turned to fall, The official investigation wound down. Ramirez was reassigned to other cases, though he continued, working on the disappearance in spare time. Families returned to normal lives, though they remained in contact with each other and Alan. In November 1989, Mrs. Durling announced her retirement. Only 58, young for retirement, but she claimed health problems made it difficult to continue working. Her farewell party was small and subdued, attended mostly by hotel staff and regular guests. Alan tried interviewing her one final time before she left, hoping she might have remembered something new or be willing to share previously held information. But Mrs. Durling was evasive, claiming the events had been too traumatic to discuss. "I've told police everything I know," she said, not meeting his eyes. "I just want to put this behind me and move on." "2 women are still missing," Alan pressed. "If you know anything at all, please tell me." Mrs. Durling looked at him then, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that might have been guilt or fear. But she shook her head and walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers. What Alan didn't know was that Mrs. Durling had been paid a substantial sum to keep quiet about what she'd witnessed. The money came from high up in the hotel's ownership structure, along with a promise that her silence would be rewarded. But the payment came with an implicit threat, that those who talked too much might find themselves in a position similar to the missing girls. By spring 1990, the case had been unofficially closed. Police had no new leads, no evidence of foul play, no bodies. The official report classified the disappearance as a probable runaway situation, suggesting the 2 women had voluntarily left their old lives behind. Alan fought this classification, filing complaints with state police and FBI, but his efforts met bureaucratic indifference. Without evidence of a federal crime, the FBI had no jurisdiction. State police deferred to local authorities, who insisted they'd conducted a thorough investigation. 28 years later, in the spring of 2017, Alan Hamilton stood in the parking lot of the Coral Reef Hotel, watching as demolition crews prepared to tear down the building that had haunted his dreams for nearly 3 decades. At 56, his blonde hair had turned grey at the temples, and the years of searching for his sister had etched deep lines around his eyes. But the fire in them remained undimmed. The hotel had closed 6 months earlier, a victim of changing tourism patterns and newer, more modern resorts. The pink and white facade that had once seemed so cheerful now looked faded and tired, paint peeling from years of salt air and neglect. But to Alan, it still held secrets he was determined to uncover. "You sure about this, Mr. Hamilton?" asked Tommy Rodriguez, the demolition foreman. "Once we start tearing into those walls, there's no going back." Alan nodded grimly. He'd spent months convincing the new property owners to let him be present during the demolition, arguing that evidence related to his sister's disappearance might still be hidden within the building. It had taken lawyers, media pressure, and a substantial donation to the local police benevolent fund, but he'd finally gotten permission to observe the process. "I've been waiting 28 years for this moment," Alan said. "I'm not backing down now." The demolition began with the interior walls, systematically stripping away decades of renovations and modifications. Alan watched every piece of debris that came out, hoping against hope that something, anything, might finally provide answers about what had happened to Jessica, Leanne, Maria, and Tasha. It was on the 2nd day of demolition that the first discovery was made. One of the workers, a young man named Carlos Mendez, was clearing debris from what had been a service corridor on the 4th floor when his crowbar hit something solid behind a section of wall that had been sealed with newer drywall. "Hey, boss," Carlos called out, "there's something back here." Tommy Rodriguez hurried over, followed closely by Alan. The sealed section was hidden behind a utility panel that had been painted over so many times it was barely visible. When they pried it open, they found a small storage space that didn't appear on any of the building's official blueprints. Inside were two battered suitcases and a pile of clothing that had been hastily stuffed into plastic garbage bags. The fabric was faded and moth-eaten, but Alan recognized it immediately. One of the items was a Florida State University sweatshirt, and another was a sundress he remembered Jessica wearing the day they'd left for spring break. "Stop everything," Alan said, his voice shaking. "We need to call the police right now." Within an hour, the demolition site was swarming with law enforcement. Detective Naomi Teller, who had recently been assigned to the cold case unit, arrived to take charge of the scene. She was in her early 40s, with short auburn hair and the kind of focused intensity that came from years of working unsolved cases. "Mr. Hamilton," she said, shaking Alan's hand, "I've read the file on your sister's disappearance. I'm sorry it's taken this long to find new evidence." Alan watched as crime scene technicians carefully removed the items from the hidden space. In addition to the clothing, they found several personal items he recognized. A broken gold locket that had belonged to Leanne, a small leather journal with TW embossed on the cover, and Jessica's Polaroid camera, its blue plastic casing cracked but still intact. "Can you develop the film?" Alan asked, pointing to the camera. "We'll have to be very careful," Detective Teller replied. "After 28 years, there's no guarantee anything will be recoverable. But we'll try." The discovery made local news first, then quickly spread to national outlets. "Missing college students, new evidence found in hotel demolition," screamed the headlines. Reporters descended on the site, and suddenly the case that had been forgotten by everyone except the families was front-page news again. 3 days later, Detective Teller called Alan with news that made his heart race. The police lab had managed to develop one roll of film from Jessica's camera. Most of the images were damaged beyond recognition, but one photo had survived relatively intact. "You need to see this," Teller said, meeting Alan at the police station. The photograph was grainy and discolored, but it clearly showed the hotel balcony where the girls had been staying. In the foreground were 3 figures that Alan recognized as Jessica, Leanne, and Tasha. But in the background, barely visible in the shadows, was another figure, someone who had been watching them from the darkness. "We're having the photo enhanced," Teller explained. "The lab thinks they might be able to get a clearer image of the person in the background." Alan stared at the photograph, feeling a mixture of vindication and dread. After all these years, they finally had proof that someone had been stalking his sister and her friends, but it also confirmed his worst fears about what had happened to them. The enhanced photograph made the next day's newspapers, while the figure in the background was still partially obscured. It was clearly a man of average height, wearing what appeared to be hotel maintenance clothing. The image sparked new interest in the case and prompted several people to come forward with information they'd kept secret for decades. One of those people was Carmen Valdez, the former housekeeping supervisor Alan had interviewed years earlier. Now in her 70s and living in a nursing home, she contacted Detective Teller with information she'd been too frightened to share before. "I saw more than I told that young man," she said, referring to Alan. "But I was scared. The hotel people, they told us not to talk about what happened that night." Carmen's new testimony was damning. She revealed that she'd seen Rick Morrison using the service elevator multiple times during the early morning hours after the girls disappeared. She'd also seen him talking to several men in expensive suits who weren't registered guests at the hotel. "They were VIP guests," Carmen explained. "Mr. Henley, he told us they were very important people who needed special privacy. We weren't supposed to ask questions or remember seeing them." Detective Teller immediately began investigating the hotel's guest records from March 1989, but found that many of the files from that period had been mysteriously destroyed in a clerical accident several years after the disappearance. Meanwhile, analysis of Tasha's journal provided additional clues. Most of the entries were typical college girl observations about classes, friends and boys. But the final entry, written the day before her disappearance, was chilling. Something weird is going on at this hotel. Mrs. Durling keeps looking at us strangely, and I swear I saw men in suits watching us from the lobby earlier. Leanne thinks I'm being paranoid, but I have a bad feeling about this place. I think we should leave early, but the others want to stay. I hope I'm wrong about this. The journal entry suggested that Tasha had sensed danger before her disappearance, which added weight to the theory that the girls had been deliberately targeted. With new evidence mounting, Detective Teller decided it was time to track down the key witnesses from the original investigation. Rick Morrison had disappeared from Panama City shortly after the girls vanished, but public records showed he'd moved to Atlanta, where he'd worked various service industry jobs under different names. Mrs. Durling proved more elusive. The address she'd given when she retired from the hotel was fake, and attempts to trace her through Social Security records had hit dead ends. But a private investigator hired by Allen finally located her in a high-end retirement community in South Carolina, living under the name Dorothy Durbin. When Detective Teller and Allen arrived at the Sunset Manor assisted living facility, they found a woman who bore little resemblance to the kind concierge they remembered. At 85, she was confined to a wheelchair and claimed to suffer from severe memory problems, but her eyes were sharp, and Allen could see recognition flickering when they introduced themselves. "I don't remember much from those days," Mrs. Durling said, her voice weak but steady. "My mind isn't what it used to be." "Mrs. Durling," Detective Teller said gently, "we found some belongings that belonged to the missing girls, hidden in a sealed section of the hotel that wasn't on any blueprints." For a moment the old woman's composure cracked. Her hands trembled as she gripped the arms of her wheelchair, and Allen saw fear flash across her weathered features. "I told you people everything I knew back then," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We don't think you did," Allen said, leaning forward. "My sister is still missing. Those were real people, Mrs. Durling. They had families who loved them. If you know something, anything at all, please help us." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an old clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, Mrs. Durling closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. "I was paid to keep quiet," she whispered. "A lot of money, more than I'd ever seen in my life." Detective Teller pulled out her recording device. "Mrs. Durling, I'm going to record this conversation. Do you consent to that?" The old woman nodded. Slowly. "I'm dying anyway. Cancer. What are they going to do to me now?" And then, 28 years after the fact, Mrs. Durling began to tell the truth about what had happened at the Coral Reef Hotel during spring break 1989. "The hotel wasn't just a regular resort," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Mr. Henley, he ran a special service for very wealthy guests, men who paid extra for privacy and entertainment." "What kind of entertainment?" Detective Teller asked. "Young women. College girls, mostly. Girls who wouldn't be missed right away, who might be written off as runaways if they disappeared." Allen felt sick to his stomach. "Are you saying the hotel was involved in human trafficking?" "I don't know what you call it," Mrs. Durling replied, "but every spring break certain girls would be selected. They'd be drugged, taken to private rooms in parts of the hotel that regular guests never saw. Some of them would be released after a few days, too traumatized and drugged to remember clearly what happened. Others—" She trailed off, but the implication was clear. "Others never came back," Allen finished. Mrs. Durling nodded. "Your sister and her friends, they were marked from the moment they checked in. Young, pretty, from good families but not wealthy enough to cause immediate political problems if they vanished." "Who were these clients?" Detective Teller demanded. "Powerful men, politicians, businessmen, judges, people who could make problems disappear if they needed to." The confession continued for over an hour, with Mrs. Durling providing details about the hotel's secret operations that made Alan's blood run cold. She described hidden rooms accessible only through service corridors, a network of corrupt local officials who helped cover up disappearances, and a systematic operation that had been going on for years before his sister became a victim. Rick Morrison was one of their scouts, she explained. He'd identify suitable targets at the clubs, drug them, and bring them back to the hotel, the girls who fought back or tried to escape. Again, she couldn't finish the sentence. "Where are they?" Alan asked, his voice breaking. "Where are my sister and her friends?" "I don't know," Mrs. Durling said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "After that night I never saw them again. But there was talk of a boat, of taking girls somewhere offshore where they couldn't cause problems." Detective Teller was already on her phone, calling for federal backup. If Mrs. Durling's story was true, this case was about to become much bigger than a simple missing persons investigation. The confession made national headlines within hours. Hotel concierge confesses to spring break trafficking ring dominated the news cycle, and suddenly the Coral Reef Hotel case became the center of a federal investigation that would span multiple states and decades. Within days, FBI agents were swarming over the demolition site, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to search for additional evidence. They found it 3 days later, in a section of the hotel's sub-basement that had been sealed off and forgotten for decades. The hidden room was a nightmare made real. Rusted bed frames with restraint points, stained mattresses, and scratches on the walls where desperate fingers had clawed at concrete. But most chilling of all was a small tape recorder hidden behind a loose brick, containing audio that would haunt everyone who heard it. The tape was damaged and partially degraded, but forensic audio specialists were able to recover enough to confirm Mrs. Durling's story. Male voices discussed moving merchandise, and in the background, barely audible, were the sounds of young women crying and pleading for help. One voice on the tape was identified as Rick Morrison. Another belonged to Robert Henley, the hotel's former general manager. But there were other voices too. Men whose identities were still being investigated by federal authorities. Alan listened to the tape once, in the FBI field office, and never wanted to hear it again. But it provided the proof that his sister and her friends had been victims of something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal agents began connecting the Coral Reef Hotel to similar operations at other resort destinations. Pattern analysis revealed that dozens of young women had disappeared from spring break locations over the years, cases that had been written off as runaways or accidents but now appeared to be part of a larger network. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Alan finally had his answer about what had happened to Jessica, Leanne, Maria, and Tasha. They had been victims of a systematic operation that preyed on young women whose disappearances could be easily explained away. The discovery at the Coral Reef Hotel would ultimately lead to indictments against dozens of people, from low-level hotel employees to powerful politicians and businessmen. It would spark congressional hearings, change laws about missing persons investigations, and provide closure for families who had been searching for answers for decades. But for Alan Hamilton, standing in the rubble of the hotel where his sister had last been seen alive, the victory felt hollow. 28 years was too long to wait for justice, and too many other families had suffered in the meantime. As demolition crews continued their work, systematically destroying the building that had harbored such dark secrets, Alan clutched the last photograph of his sister and her friends. The 4 young women smiling at the camera, full of life and hope, unaware that they were walking into a trap that had been set specifically for them. The Coral Reef Hotel was finally coming down, but the memories of what had happened within its walls would linger forever. And somewhere, in an unmarked grave or at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, Jessica Hamilton and her friends were finally at peace, their story told, and their killers brought to justice. The last section of the hotel to be demolished was the fourth floor, where room 412 had once stood. As the wrecking ball swung toward the pink and white facade, Alan whispered a final goodbye to his sister, knowing that her story would never be forgotten again. Mrs. Durling's confession had opened the floodgates, but Detective Naomi Teller knew they needed more than the word of a dying woman to bring down what appeared to be a massive conspiracy. The FBI had taken over the case, and federal agents were now working around the clock to piece together the full extent of the trafficking operation that had operated out of the Coral Reef Hotel. Agent Sarah Chen, a seasoned investigator with the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, had been assigned to lead the federal investigation. She sat across from Mrs. Durling in the retirement home's common room, a stack of photographs spread on the table between them. "I need you to look at these pictures," Agent Chen said gently. "Some of these men may have been clients at the hotel. Can you identify any of them?" Mrs. Durling's arthritic fingers trembled as she sorted through the photographs. They were surveillance photos and official portraits of politicians, businessmen, and other prominent figures from the late 1980s and early 1990s. "Him," she said, pointing to a photo of a distinguished-looking man in his 50s. "He came to the hotel 3 or 4 times a year, always paid in cash, always requested the special accommodations." Agent Chen made a note. The man in the photograph was Senator William Blackwood, who had served in the Florida State Senate from 1985 to 1995 before moving to Washington as a congressman. He was now in his 80s and serving on several corporate boards. "And him," Mrs. Durling continued, pointing to another photograph. "He was there the night those girls disappeared. I remember because he was angry about something, shouting at Mr. Henley about keeping things quiet." The second photograph showed Judge Harold Pierce, who had presided over the circuit court in Panama City during the 1980s and 1990s. He had died 5 years earlier, but his involvement in the conspiracy explained why the original investigation had been so thoroughly buried. As Mrs. Durling continued identifying faces, the scope of the corruption became clear. The trafficking operation had been protected by a network of powerful men who had both profited from it and ensured that any investigations would be derailed before they could threaten their interests. Meanwhile, Alan Hamilton was conducting his own investigation with the help of a private detective named Marcus Webb. A former FBI agent who had left the bureau after becoming disgusted with political interference in sensitive cases, Webb had agreed to help Alan track down the remaining suspects. Their first target was Rick Morrison, who had disappeared from Panama City shortly after the girl's disappearance, but had left a trail of employment records and credit applications that Webb was able to follow. "Found him," Webb announced, walking into the small office they had rented in Panama City. "He's been living in Atlanta under the name Richard Mason, works as a bartender at a hotel near the airport." Alan felt his pulse quicken. After 28 years, they were finally going to confront the man who had lured his sister and her friends to their deaths. The drive to Atlanta took 4 hours, during which Alan rehearsed what he would say to Rick Morrison. He wanted answers, but he also wanted justice, and he wasn't sure he could control himself when he finally came face to face with the man who had destroyed his family. They found Rick working the afternoon shift at a generic chain hotel that catered to business travelers and airline crews. At 55, he was still recognizable, though his hair had thinned and his face showed the wear of nearly 3 decades of looking over his shoulder. Webb approached the bar first, ordering a beer and making small talk while Alan positioned himself near the exit to prevent Rick from fleeing. When Webb showed his investigator's license and mentioned the Coral Reef Hotel, the color drained from Rick's face. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rick said, but his hands were shaking as he reached for a towel to wipe down the bar. "We have Mrs. Durling's confession," Webb said quietly. "We know about the trafficking operation, we know about the VIP clients, and we know what happened to those 4 college girls in 1989. Rick's eyes darted toward the exit, where he saw Alan standing with his arms crossed, blocking the way out. Recognition dawned on his face as he realized who Alan was. "You're her brother," Rick whispered. "Jessica's brother." "That's right," Alan said, walking toward the bar. "And you're going to tell me exactly what happened to my sister. The confrontation might have turned violent if Webb hadn't intervened, reminding both men that they needed Rick's cooperation if they wanted to see justice done. After some negotiation, Rick agreed to meet them at a nearby diner after his shift ended, promising to tell them everything he knew. 3 hours later, Rick Morrison sat in a corner booth at a 24-hour diner, chain-smoking cigarettes and avoiding eye contact with Alan. His confession came in fits and starts, interrupted by long silences and occasional tears. "I never meant for things to go so far," he began. "At first, it was just about identifying girls who were vulnerable, who wouldn't be missed right away. Most of them were released after a few days, drugged enough that they couldn't remember details, but alive." "But not my sister," Alan said, his voice deadly quiet. Rick shook his head. "Your sister and her friends were different. They saw too much, knew too much. Tasha had been asking questions about the hotel's layout, taking pictures of areas she wasn't supposed to see, and Jessica's camera—" He trailed off, but Alan pressed him to continue. "What about Jessica's camera?" "She took a picture that night. On the balcony, it showed one of the clients who was supposed to be anonymous. When they developed the film later, they realized they couldn't let her live." Alan felt sick to his stomach. His sister had been murdered because she had accidentally photographed one of the trafficking operation's customers. "Where are they?" Alan demanded. "Where are their bodies?" Rick was crying now, years of guilt and fear finally breaking through his carefully constructed facade. "There was a boat," he said. "A yacht owned by one of the clients. They were taken offshore and he—" Couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Alan understood what had happened to his sister and her friends. The confession was recorded and immediately turned over to federal authorities. Within days, Rick Morrison was in federal custody, charged with kidnapping, trafficking, and accessory to murder. His cooperation would prove crucial in identifying the other members of the conspiracy. Agent Chen was simultaneously working to track down Robert Henley, the hotel's former general manager. Unlike Rick, Henley had used his connections to reinvent himself completely after leaving Panama City. He had moved to the Bahamas, where he operated a series of legitimate businesses that served as fronts for continued criminal activity. The process of extraditing Henley took months, complicated by his dual citizenship and the web of shell companies he had used to hide his assets. But eventually, Bahamian authorities arrested him at his Nassau mansion, and he was brought back to Florida to face federal charges. Henley proved to be a harder nut to crack than Rick Morrison. Represented by a team of expensive lawyers, he denied all involvement in the trafficking operation and claimed that any illegal activities at the Coral Reef Hotel had occurred without his knowledge. But Agent Chen had been building a case based on financial records, witness testimony, and physical evidence recovered from the hotel demolition. Bank records showed regular cash deposits into accounts controlled by Henley, deposits that coincided with the visits of VIP clients to the hotel. More damaging still was the testimony of other hotel employees who had been located and offered immunity in exchange for their cooperation. Carmen Valdez, the former housekeeping supervisor, provided detailed accounts of the special procedures used to prepare rooms for VIP guests. Kitchen staff testified about meals delivered to areas of the hotel that weren't supposed to exist. Maintenance workers described installing soundproofing and security equipment in hidden rooms. As the evidence mounted, several of Henley's co-conspirators began to flip, providing testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. The web of corruption that had protected the trafficking operation for decades began to unravel as investigators followed the money trail and connected the dots between various criminal enterprises. The investigation revealed that the Coral Reef Hotel had been just one node in a much larger network of trafficking operations that spanned multiple states and countries. Similar hotels and resorts had been used to facilitate the exploitation of young women, all protected by the same network of corrupt officials and wealthy clients. Senator Blackwood's involvement proved particularly damaging to the conspiracy. As a sitting politician, he had used his influence to ensure that any investigations into missing persons cases at spring break destinations were quickly closed or transferred to jurisdictions where they could be buried. His legislative record showed a pattern of opposing bills that would have strengthened protections for trafficking victims or increased penalties for those who facilitated their exploitation. When FBI agents arrived at Blackwood's Washington office, with an arrest warrant, they found him frantically shredding documents. A search of his home and offices revealed a cache of compromising photographs and videos that had apparently been used to blackmail other powerful individuals into participating in or protecting the trafficking network. The arrests sent shockwaves through political and business circles in Florida and beyond. Senator Blackwood's perp walk made front-page news across the country, and suddenly the spring break disappearance case was dominating cable news coverage and social media discussions. Alan Hamilton found himself thrust into the spotlight as the face of the victims' families. News producers competed to book him for interviews, and he received hundreds of calls from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and other families of missing persons who hoped his success might help solve their own cases. "I never wanted to be famous," Alan told Detective Teller during one of their regular meetings. "I just wanted to find my sister." The media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept pressure on law enforcement to pursue every lead and prosecute every suspect. On the other hand, it turned his personal tragedy into a public spectacle, with strangers on the internet debating the details of his sister's death and offering unsolicited theories about what had happened. The legal proceedings moved slowly, but steadily forward. Rick Morrison pleaded guilty to federal charges in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His cooperation continued to be valuable as prosecutors built cases against the other defendants. Robert Henley maintained his innocence longer, but eventually accepted a plea deal when it became clear that the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence given his age. Senator Blackwood's case proved more complex. His lawyers argued that his actions as a legislator were protected by constitutional immunity and that any communications about the trafficking operation fell under legislative privilege. The legal battles over these claims delayed his trial for over a year. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation had expanded to include similar operations in other tourist destinations. Agent Chen found herself leading a task force that was investigating dozens of cases involving missing young women from spring break locations, summer resorts, and college towns across the southeast. The patterns were eerily similar. Young women would disappear during peak tourist seasons, usually after being drugged at bars or clubs. Local police investigations would be perfunctory, often concluding that the victims had simply decided to start new lives elsewhere. In many cases, the investigating officers had financial connections to the businesses where the disappearances occurred. "It's like they had a playbook," Agent Chen told Alan during one of their briefings. "The same methods, the same cover-up techniques, the same type of victims. This wasn't just the Coral Reef Hotel. This was a systematic operation that had been refined over decades. The scope of the conspiracy became clearer as more suspects were arrested and agreed to cooperate. A yacht charter company based in Key West had been used to transport victims to private islands where they could be held without risk of discovery. A network of corrupt doctors had provided drugs and medical care to keep victims compliant. Even some funeral directors had been involved, providing false death certificates and cremation services to hide evidence of murders. As the investigation progressed, search teams began locating burial sites in remote areas of Florida and Georgia. The first discovery came when a former yacht captain, facing life in prison, agreed to show authorities where victims had been buried on a private island off the coast of Naples. The island had been owned by a deceased businessman named Vincent Castellano, who had apparently served as one of the trafficking network's financiers. Ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple burial sites scattered across the 20-acre property. The excavation was painstaking work, complicated by decades of weather and the need to preserve any evidence that might be found with the remains. But eventually, forensic anthropologists began recovering bodies and personal effects that could be used to identify victims. It was on a grey morning in November 2018 that Alan received the call he had been both hoping for and dreading for nearly 30 years. DNA testing had positively identified two of the bodies found on Castellano's Island as Leanne Parker and Maria Thompson. "We found them," Detective Teller told him over the phone. "I'm so sorry, Alan, but at least their families will have closure." The discovery of Leanne and Maria's remains was bittersweet for Alan. He was relieved that their families would finally be able to lay them to rest. But the confirmation that his sister's friends were dead made it even more likely that Jessica was gone too. Tasha Williams's body was found 2 weeks later at a different burial site on the mainland. She had been buried in a wooded area near a defunct logging road, her remains wrapped in plastic and covered with lime in an apparent attempt to accelerate decomposition. But Jessica's body remained missing. Despite extensive searches of all the known burial sites and interrogations of every suspect in custody, no one could provide definitive information about what had happened to her remains. The memorial service for Leanne, Maria, and Tasha was held at Florida State University, where hundreds of people gathered to remember the 3 young women whose lives had been cut short by greed and corruption. Their families spoke about their daughters' dreams and aspirations, the careers they had planned, and the families they had hoped to raise. Alan spoke last, reading from a letter Jessica had written to him during her freshman year of college. In it, she had talked about her excitement for the future and her plans to become a photojournalist, documenting stories that needed to be told. Jessica always said that everyone's story deserved to be heard, Alan told the crowd. She would want their story to be told, to make sure that this never happens to anyone else's daughter or sister. The media coverage of the memorial service sparked a national conversation about the vulnerability of young women traveling during spring break and summer vacations. College campuses across the country implemented new safety programs, and several states passed laws requiring more thorough investigations of missing persons cases involving young adults. The legal proceedings continued through 2019 and into 2020. Senator Blackwood's trial finally began in federal court in Miami, where prosecutors laid out a detailed case showing how he had used his political influence to protect the trafficking operation for nearly 2 decades. The evidence was damning. Recorded phone conversations showed Blackwood discussing payoffs to local officials. Financial records revealed payments from shell companies controlled by the trafficking network. Most compelling of all were the videos found in his home, which showed him participating in the abuse of young women at various resort locations. Blackwood's defense team argued that their client was being scapegoated for crimes committed by others, but the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction of a sitting U.S. senator sent shockwaves through Washington and sparked investigations into other politicians who might have been connected to the trafficking network. Several other officials resigned or announced they would not seek re-election, rather than face scrutiny of their own relationships with the conspiracy's participants. But for Allen, the legal victories felt incomplete without finding Jessica's body. He continued to push investigators to follow every lead, offering rewards for information and personally visiting every potential burial site that was discovered. The break in Jessica's case came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic was shutting down much of the country, Allen received a letter at his Panama City apartment. It had no return address, and the handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone in distress or poor. "Health, Mr. Hamilton," the letter began. "I know what happened to your sister. I was there that night, and I've been carrying the guilt for 31 years. I'm dying now, and I can't take this secret to my grave. If you want to know the truth about Jessica, meet me at the Shrimp Basket restaurant on Highway 98 this Saturday at noon. Come alone, and bring the last photograph you have of her." Allen's hands were shaking as he read the letter. After all these years, someone was finally willing to tell him what had happened to Jessica. He called Detective Teller immediately, but she advised caution. "This could be a crank," she warned, "or it could be dangerous. We should bring backup." But Allen was determined to follow the letter's instructions exactly. He had waited too long for answers to risk scaring away someone who might have the truth about his sister's fate. Saturday arrived gray and rainy, typical weather for the Florida Panhandle in late spring. Allen drove to the Shrimp Basket, a weathered seafood restaurant that had been serving tourists and locals for decades. He carried Jessica's last photograph in his jacket pocket, the image of 4 young women on a hotel balcony that had started this long journey toward justice. The restaurant was nearly empty due to pandemic restrictions, just a few scattered customers eating at socially distanced tables. Allen chose a booth near the back and ordered coffee, watching the door for anyone who might be his mysterious correspondent. At 12:15, an elderly man in a wheelchair was pushed into the restaurant by a middle-aged woman who appeared to be his caregiver. The man was gaunt and pale, clearly in the final stages of some terminal illness. But his eyes were alert, and when he saw Allen, he nodded toward the booth. "Mr. Hamilton," the man asked, as his caregiver helped him transfer to the restaurant booth. "I'm Captain James Morrison. I think you knew my nephew Rick." Allen felt his heart race. Rick Morrison's uncle had been the one to send the letter. This was someone who had been part of the trafficking operation from the beginning. "I captained the yacht that was used to transport the girls," James Morrison continued, his voice weak but clear. "I've been dying of lung cancer for 6 months now, and I can't stand the thought of taking this secret with me." The caregiver, who Morrison introduced as his daughter Sarah, excused herself to give them privacy. She made it clear that she knew why they were meeting and supported her father's decision to come forward. "Tell me about Jessica," Allen said, pulling out the photograph and placing it on the table between them. Morrison looked at the picture for a long moment, tears forming in his eyes. "She was different from the others," he said, "stronger, more defiant. Even after they drugged her, she kept trying to escape." He went on to describe the night of March 15, 1989, when he had been ordered to take 4 young women to a private island owned by Vincent Castellano. 3 of the women, Leanne, Maria, and Tasha, had been heavily sedated and barely conscious, but Jessica had somehow metabolized the drugs more quickly and was alert enough to understand what was happening to her. "She fought them every step of the way," Morrison said. Even when they tied her up, she kept trying to get free. She was screaming for help, calling out your name. Alan felt tears streaming down his face as he listened to the captain's account of his sister's final hours. But he needed to hear the whole truth, no matter how painful. "What happened to her?" he asked. Morrison's voice broke as he continued his story. "We were about 20 miles offshore when she managed to get loose from her restraints. I was steering the boat, and the other men were below deck with the other girls. Jessica came running up from the cabin, and before anyone could—" "Stop her! She jumped overboard!" Alan felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "She jumped?" It was dark, rough seas. She must have known she couldn't swim to shore from that far out, but she chose to take her chances in the water rather than face whatever was waiting for her on the island. Morrison described how they had searched for Jessica for over an hour, using spotlights and circling the area where she had gone into the water. But the Gulf of Mexico at night was vast and unforgiving, and they never found any trace of her. "I wanted to call the Coast Guard," Morrison said, "but the other men threatened to kill me if I did. They said no one would believe a story about a girl jumping off a yacht in the middle of the night." The revelation that Jessica had died trying to escape rather than as a victim of murder was somehow both devastating and comforting to Alan. His sister had not gone quietly into the darkness. She had fought until the very end, choosing death over submission. "Why didn't you come forward before now?" Alan asked. Morrison explained that he had been terrified of the men he had worked for, knowing that they had killed dozens of people to protect their operation. Even after most of them had been arrested, he'd been afraid that there were others still out there who might retaliate against him or his family. "But when I got the cancer diagnosis," he said, "I realized I had a chance to do one right thing before I died. Your sister deserved to have her story told." Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a small waterproof bag. Inside was a gold necklace with a small heart-shaped pendant, jewelry that Alan recognized as belonging to Jessica. "She was wearing this when she jumped," Morrison said, handing the bag to Alan. "It must have come off in the water. We found it floating near where we last saw her." Alan held the necklace with trembling hands, the last physical connection he would ever have to his sister. It was the same necklace Jessica had worn in dozens of photographs over the years, a Christmas gift from their parents when she turned 16. The meeting with Captain Morrison lasted for over 2 hours, as the dying man provided every detail he could remember about that terrible night and the trafficking operation he had unwillingly served. His testimony would later be crucial in closing several cold cases and identifying burial sites for other victims. But for Alan, the most important revelation was that Jessica had died on her own terms. She had faced an impossible situation and chosen the only form of freedom available to her, even knowing it would likely cost her life. Morrison died 3 weeks after their meeting, taking his remaining secrets with him to the grave. But his daughter, Sarah, provided investigators with documents and recordings that her father had secretly kept as insurance against his former associates. With the captain's testimony and physical evidence, authorities were finally able to close Jessica's case. Her death was officially ruled a drowning, but the circumstances were clear. She had died attempting to escape from kidnappers who intended to sell her into sexual slavery. The revelation of Jessica's fate provided closure for Alan and his family, though the pain of losing her would never fully heal. But it also added a new dimension to the story that had captivated the nation for over 3 years. Jessica Hamilton became a symbol of resistance, a young woman who had refused to be a victim, even in the face of certain death. Her story inspired changes in how law enforcement investigated missing persons cases, particularly those involving young women who disappeared during travel. The Coral Reef Hotel site, which had been cleared and vacant since the demolition, was purchased by a non-profit organization and turned into a memorial park. 4 granite benches were installed overlooking the Gulf of Mexico, each one bearing the name of one of the victims: Jessica Hamilton, Leanne Parker, Maria Thompson, and Tasha Williams. A central monument featured a bronze plaque with Jessica's photograph and a quote from one of her college essays about the importance of bearing witness to injustice. Visitors could sit by the water and remember 4 young women whose lives had been cut short by greed and corruption, but whose stories had ultimately helped bring about justice for countless others. Alan attended the Memorial Park's dedication ceremony on a sunny spring morning exactly 32 years after his sister's disappearance. He stood at the water's edge, holding the last photograph of Jessica and her friends, and finally felt a sense of peace. The fight for justice had taken over half his life, but it had been worth it. Jessica's story had been told, her killers had been brought to justice, and other families had been spared the agony his family had endured. As he walked away from the memorial, Alan could almost hear his sister's voice carried on the ocean breeze, reminding him that everyone's story deserved to be heard. The 4 young women who had come to Panama City for a week of fun and friendship had become symbols of resilience and justice, their memory preserved in stone and in the countless lives their story had touched. The Coral Reef Hotel was gone, but the truth about what had happened there would never be forgotten. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the Gulf of Mexico, Jessica Hamilton was finally at rest, her story told and her legacy secure. What would you do if someone you loved vanished without a trace? Would you stop searching, or would you spend your life demanding the truth? If this story of courage, corruption, and a brother's relentless pursuit of justice moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more true crime stories that need to be told.